Well, continuing my exploration of how to study the canon, in this video I'd like to give you a few rules for studying the canon for yourself and telling you how to build your own canon through your study of the larger canon. This is what I mean by creating your own personal canon of literature. And I'm going to talk about how I did that and what I think is involved in the process of doing that. This process can take years. In fact, it probably should take years. But many of you have probably already started some of the first steps that you need to take in order to study the canon. Somebody in the community tab on my YouTube channel said that studying the canon can sometimes feel like climbing Mount Everest without a guide. I sympathize. That really resonates with me because I have also kind of wandered away and gone up one direction and doubled back and found a better path until, I'm not at the top by any means, but I do have a good understanding of the canon. And I think that for public readers, for anyone who's not in the academy, even people who are in the academy, it can be difficult understanding what exactly the canon is. In a canon, in this video, I mean canon by simply a list that's put together by an authority or a committee of authorities of works that represent the best that has been thought or said. So this could be an anthology, it could be like the 1983 Harvard list. In a video after this, I'm going to give you a list of what I think is the entire canon. It's over 750 names in this list, and it's taken me weeks to compile. And actually, if you look at the backlog, probably years of reading to really kind of understand how to put this list together. It's chronological, beginning with the Old English poets all the way up to poets who were born up to 1945. So I think the last person on my list actually is Wendy Cope, and the first is Caedmon. Okay, I'm going to be releasing that soon. It's taken me weeks to do, and I want to make sure I do it right before I release it. But in this video, let me tell you about how to navigate that list, what's going to go into your process of reading. First, let's begin with a metaphor. I think that reading the canon should be like trawling. Trawling is a certain type of fishing that I used to do. You sit in a boat and you let the wind carry you across the surface of the lake, and you drop a line down to the bottom. And as the boat is being carried by the wind or a motor, you have your finger on the line waiting to detect a strike. This, I think, is how you should read the canon. You should open an anthology. You should start perhaps from the beginning, in the middle, at the end, and read however you want. But as you're reading, recognize that some poems you will just glide through. They won't strike. But some poems will. And it's those poems you want to keep a record of in order to compile your own canon. A list of poems or works that have been important to you in some way. I think that reading is discovery, and I'm going to talk about this soon. It's not just a discovery of what's been read, but it's a self-discovery process in which you're learning more about yourself and your own values as a reader, which you otherwise might not have known if you didn't read. So constructing a canon is like keeping a list of these fish that you've caught. Elizabeth Bishop has a beautiful poem, The Fish. It's often anthologized, often taught for good reason. I think it's a poem about reading. I think for Bishop, it was actually a poem about writing a poem. She catches the fish and she lets it go. And I think it's part of this metaphor that I want to get across in how should you read an anthology or study the canon. I love what Robert Frost says about reading, by the way. He says, "It is absurd to think that the only way to tell if a poem is lasting is to wait and see if it lasts. The right reader of a good poem can tell the moment it strikes him that he has taken an immortal wound, that he will never get over it. That is to say, permanence in poetry, as in love, is perceived instantly. It hasn't to await the test of time. The proof of a poem is not that we have never forgotten it, but that we knew at sight we never could forget it." And this is what I mean by constructing your own canon. It's not about compiling a list of works that you think everyone else should read, but in this case, it's about keeping a record of those poems, plays that have left that indelible mark, that what Frost calls the immortal wound. Some poets will leave this on you, and others will not. There's nothing wrong with you if Elizabeth Bishop never leaves this mark on you. Her poem, The Riverman, has certainly left some kind of a strange mark on me. But as you go through the canon, you'll find that some poets and their poems strike you in a way that others don't. And that's part of the discovery process. Now let me tell you 3 kinds of reading that I think that there are. The first is comfort reading. And this is like going to a party with friends. You're reading books that you already know, or by authors that you're already familiar with, or you're reading a certain genre of poetry or novels that you know you enjoy. If you love a mystery thriller, then you know which authors you're going to go to, and you know that when they release a new novel, you know you're going to read those books. That's comfort reading. Perfectly fine sort of reading. The second kind of reading is educational reading. This is where you're trying to learn a new skill or research a certain topic. It's got this utilitarian motivation behind it. You want to get something out of it that's going to be useful to your intellect, to the way you live life. This kind of reading is like going to a lecture by yourself. It's not like going to a party. It's kind of like you're there to learn. Sometimes there are these encounters with beauty. Sometimes you do get these immortal wounds from this educational kind of reading, but I think that it's rare and that when it does happen, it's somewhat accidental. But the third kind of reading is what I call discovery reading. You're reading with a question in mind. You're reading to find something out. You're reading with a hunger, a desire, and you know when you've found the food. This is a discovery of not just what's out there, but also about yourself, as I said, a self-discovery method. And keeping a record of these discoveries that really matter to you is what I mean by compiling your own canon. So let me give you an example from my own life and how I came to become a reader. I started reading as a means to an end, as a way to explain certain spiritual experiences I had in nature as a young child. I grew up in the pine lands of Louisiana, and I actually hated reading. I much preferred walking in the woods, and most of all sitting on the banks of this creek that was deep in the woods. And I had certain spiritual, you might say mystical experiences at the creek. They weren't mind-blowing, but they were certainly out of the normative experience of the world around me. I didn't know anyone who spoke of these experiences. And I'm not going to go into detail because I've written about it in an essay, and you can find the link to that essay in the description if you're interested in it. But in short, I think these were encounters with beauty. And not just beauty, but something beyond the beauty. And maybe if you've experienced it, you know what I'm talking about, but it's not something that's easy to explain. I'll just say that it was this enchanting spiritual kind of desire, and at the same time, immensely perplexing and frustrating. And I wanted to understand what it meant. Well, when I was 12, Hurricane Katrina passed over my hometown and destroyed much of the woods, and my family relocated to another state. Even though I was estranged from the woods, I still remembered those early experiences and sought to understand them. And this led me to reading theology and literature. And in my reading, I discovered people who I thought, are they describing the same thing that I felt? And sure enough, the more I read, the more I discovered that people were actually talking about these experiences. It was actually C.S. Lewis's autobiography that really convinced me that, okay, this is real. He really provided a vocabulary for talking about certain spiritual experiences that were very similar to mine. So I took his book and I wrote down every book that he mentioned and every poet that he mentioned, and I began reading them. So I kind of constructed a canon out of what Lewis read, and then from there discovered the German Romantics, the English Romantics, the American Transcendentalists, and it was there where I really found poets who were describing what I had experienced at the creek as a young age, and also providing and enriching a vocabulary around those experiences. So I became absolutely obsessed with these poets who were talking about an experience that I thought I was the only one who had. And in a way, this is what led me, to community college, and then to state college, and then eventually to graduate school, was this question. So out of my own experience, I have a few principles that you can apply when you're reading the canon. The first is this. Read with some kind of question. Identify that question as best you can, because sometimes the question you begin with will change, and that's a good thing. So this question could be something like mine. It could be, what did my early experiences in nature mean? And am I alone in these experiences? Or it could be something like, how do I find relief from depression in poetry? That's an important one. How can the poets help me find meaning and beauty in my own life? That's a really good question. How can poets give me examples of how to make sense of my life, how to organize it within a narrative framework, in a narrative arc? That's another important question. It might be that you're looking for some kind of beauty or solace. Or perhaps you want to find an attitude for living well. You'll know what your question is when you dig deep and you think a little bit about who you are and what you want to get from poetry. And you might, if you don't know what it is, you might think, well, what has really inspired me in my reading before? Was it the reading of great heroes, people who have stood up in the face of adversity and were strong? Or did I really enjoy comedy? Or did I really enjoy poems about birds? Maybe you're obsessed with birds. You'll have an idea of this question much better than the examples that I can give. The second rule is, when you've found an author whose poetry strikes you and with whom you have some kind of connection, where he or she is articulating something true to your own experience, then read about that poet and then read everything that they've read, or a few things that were most important to them. This will help you find where the fish are. If it's a big lake, the Canon, and once you start getting strikes, you need to figure out, okay, what is it about this area? Why are the fish here for me? And one of the ways to figure that out is through reading what this poet that you found has read. Or perhaps there are other poets who moved in their circles. So with Elizabeth Bishop, you might also throw in Marianne Moore, or Ted Hughes, or a few others, or Robert Lowell, and start exploring their poetry a little bit more. Again, mixing metaphors here, because I feel like this is so ineffable, this kind of study that I'm advocating here, because it's not purely academic, and it's anyway. So pardon the mixed metaphors, but the third rule is to keep a commonplace book. Commonplace book is a blank journal. Don't have mine at hand. I have several of them. It's just a blank journal. It could be lined. It could just be blank pages. And whenever you find a poem, you either write down the title of it, or you copy the entire poem out. If it's too long, copy out the portion that meant the most to you, and go back and revisit it. There's something about writing out a poem by hand that has really captured your imagination. There's something about reading it again in your own handwriting that I think makes it yours, both through the physical and bodily process of writing it out with your own hand, but also reading it in your own hand. There's something embodied about that I think makes the poem ours in a new sense. Read it aloud, memorize it, but keep a record of it. And a commonplace book is a really great way to do that. It's pretty much the method that readers have been using for hundreds of years. And my fourth piece of advice is to read widely, within and outside of your interests. So once you've found your coterie of poets who really speak your language, read deeply there, but also keep reading and exploring in other areas. In this, you have to balance the two hand in hand, because as you're exploring, as you're reading, you'll also find more and add more to your coterie. But you don't want to get so narrow that you're only focusing on the 4 or 5 poets. This is something I have to keep in mind as somebody who was just obsessed with the Romantics. I had to really force myself to read other types of poetry throughout my education, and it really worked out well. There's still some types of poetry which I don't love, and I think I mentioned this in another video. It's Restoration drama. I don't know why. I dislike it, and perhaps one day I'll grow into Restoration drama, and I'll just find it hilarious and engaging. But that day is not today, and it wasn't yesterday, and that might be something that I have to live with for the rest of my life. So as you're reading widely on the surface and deeply among these poets that you've found, read expectantly. Read with your finger on the line, attentive to how you're processing poetry, and read what you've read before again. Because sometimes you weren't reading carefully enough, or you've learned something so that the past poets who didn't mean much before suddenly take on new significance, and you want to keep that discovery open. So read deeply in what you love and widely in what you don't know. Now that I've given that advice, I can release the large video on the Canon, or the large master list of the Canon, of 700 plus poets that I think will give you a good way into a map of the Canon. We're going to find in this enormous list which poets are named the most in anthologies, which ones are most important, which ones are most included in libraries, and which ones have been forgotten, but they're going to be there. So I hope this was helpful. Thanks everyone for watching, and until next time.